The knock came just after 11, a dull thud against the front door that felt out of place in the quiet of my house. I pushed myself up from the armchair, my knees stiff from sitting too long, and listened for a second knock before reaching for the handle. The cold air outside hit my face as I opened the door and saw my younger brother standing on the porch with his hands in his coat pockets, staring at me like he expected to find someone else living here. There was no greeting. He stepped forward and said he needed to talk about something important, and the way he said it felt more like an order than a request. I let him in, watching the way he scanned the hallway as if measuring it. The lamp in the corner cast a low yellow light across the room, and the shadows under his eyes made his expression hard to read. He didn't sit. He stood just past the doorway, turning slightly to look toward the living room, taking in the space with a slow, deliberate sweep. It reminded me of men who walk through a property before deciding if it's worth buying. I felt the shift in his posture before he spoke again, and the shift told me the conversation wouldn't be simple. "You shouldn't be handling all this alone anymore," he said, nodding toward the stack of mail on the table like he'd found proof of something. His voice stayed calm, but it carried the tone of someone who had rehearsed the line. I asked what he meant, and he answered in the same steady voice that I was getting older, and things were getting complicated. The words landed with a quiet sting. He phrased it like concern, but every part of me felt the weight behind it. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a push. I moved to the kitchen counter and leaned on it lightly, giving myself a moment to steady my breath. He followed with slow steps, eyes shifting from the cabinets to the clock on the wall. "You've done enough on your own," he continued, adding that the house, the accounts, and the property paperwork were a lot to keep track of. He spoke like someone listing tasks he intended to take over. My jaw tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. Losing my patience would give him something he could twist later. He rested a hand on the back of a chair and said he had been thinking about this for a long time, and that he wanted to make sure everything stays safe. The word safe carried a strange echo. It suggested danger, but not the kind that comes from outside. It sounded like he believed the danger was me. He didn't look at my face when he said it. He kept his eyes on the room, on the framed photos, on the table I built 30 years ago, on the mail he had glanced at earlier. When he finally met my eyes, he added, "We can make things official soon." The sentence came out soft, but the firmness underneath it couldn't be missed. Something official meant paperwork. Paperwork meant control. Control meant he had already considered the steps he's intended to take. I felt the first clear piece slide into place then. This wasn't a sudden concern brought on by late-night worry. This was the continuation of a plan that began long before he knocked on my door. The timing, the tone, the quiet confidence, it all pointed to preparation. I could see it in the way he stood there, comfortable and sure, like a man who believed he was simply finishing a conversation he'd already had with himself. I nodded once, not in agreement, but to buy myself a few seconds of silence. His words stayed hanging between us, and in that silence, I understood the threat hidden in the softness. He wasn't offering help. He was asking for authority, and he expected me to step aside. I stayed standing after he left, listening to the quiet settle back into the walls like dust returning to shelves. The house always felt heavier at night, but lately the weight came from somewhere deeper. His visit stirred memories I had pushed aside, memories that carried the first signs that something inside the family had shifted. I had been the one who carried most of the load when we were younger, the one who handled work, bills, and repairs while he drifted between jobs. I never minded it. That was the role I knew. But roles change with age, and the change doesn't always come from the person living it. The days felt longer after my wife passed. Her absence didn't show itself with one loud moment. It settled quietly, the way the house felt colder even when the heater worked fine. Her voice, her steps, her habits, all of it left a kind of space that stayed open no matter what I filled it with. My brother started coming around more during that time. He'd bring groceries, sometimes sit with me for an hour, and call it checking in. I didn't question it then. Losing someone close changes how people move around you, and I thought he was trying to be present in the only way he knew. It wasn't until my health scare 2 years ago that his behavior took a different tone. A simple dizziness spell that sent me to the hospital overnight became, in his eyes, a sign that I couldn't be trusted with the basics of my own life. He didn't say it outright, but the shift was noticeable. He started asking about my bills, the insurance, the property taxes. He'd accidentally show up when I met with the plumber or the electrician, as if I needed supervision to change a pipe or sign a receipt. At first, I tried to take it as concern. A man alone can look more fragile than he feels. The first real red flag came one morning when he suggested we open a joint account, just in case something happened. He said it with a half smile, pretending it was a normal step for brothers. I remember setting my coffee down and studying his face, trying to see if he understood what he was asking. His eyes didn't show worry, they showed expectation. He acted like I should have already agreed. That was the moment I felt a faint tug of unease, the kind that doesn't spark panic, but reshapes how you hear someone's voice. Family dinners didn't help. He started answering questions directed at me, telling stories over mine, and correcting details that didn't need correcting. When a nephew asked about a business decision I made years ago, my brother laughed lightly and said, "He forgets things now." It wasn't a joke. It was a rehearsal. He used small public moments to paint a picture of me I didn't recognize, and people nodded along the way people do when they assume the younger man knows better. What unsettled me most wasn't the words he used. It was the confidence behind them. It felt less like he was checking on me and more like he was preparing a case. He acted as though every moment of silence meant I needed direction, and every pause meant I was drifting somewhere he needed to pull me back from. Protection slowly turned into guidance, and guidance began to feel like authority. There was one question he asked that stayed with me longer than any other. He stood in my kitchen after bringing over soup one afternoon and said, "Who will manage things when you can't?" He said it softly, but the meaning behind it carried weight. It wasn't about the future. It was about now. He wanted to know when I planned to hand things over. That question didn't feel like concern. It felt like the first quiet step towards something he had already decided. The first sign that something in my life was being moved without my permission came on a quiet Tuesday morning. I walked to the mailbox like I always did, expecting the usual stack of envelopes that kept my routines in order. Instead, the box was nearly empty. Only 2 flyers sat inside, their edges curled from the cold air. I looked up and down the street, as if the missing mail could be hiding in plain sight. Financial statements usually arrived the first week of the month, and I had been waiting for one in particular. The absence didn't feel like a delay. It felt like removal. Inside the house, I checked the table where I kept recent letters. What was there didn't match what should have been there. A few utility bills, one medical reminder card, no statements, no insurance documents. I could picture the envelopes clearly because I opened them in the same place every time. Their absence formed a clean, unnatural gap. While I stood there, my brother walked in without knocking, holding a plastic bag of groceries like a peace offering. He glanced at the table before I could cover it with my hand, and he said he'd been helping by sorting a few things so I wouldn't stress myself. The words sounded casual, but the ease with which he said them tightened something in my chest. I asked what exactly he had sorted, and he shrugged like it didn't matter. He said he tossed junk mail, moved the important letters to a safe place, and paid a bill I had forgotten. He said it all too smoothly, as if he'd practiced the lines. I told him I didn't recall asking for that kind of help. His smile thinned at the edges, and he changed the subject with an almost forced cheerfulness. I didn't press it, but the moment stayed sharp in my mind like a small cut that doesn't bleed, but stings long after it happens. Later that afternoon, I logged into my online banking, something I hadn't done in a week. A charge appeared on the account, one I did not authorize. It wasn't a large amount, but it was new, and it stood out in a row of familiar numbers. When I called my brother to ask about it, he gave a quick, annoyed sigh before saying he had no idea what I was talking about. He told me I must have forgotten the purchase and suggested I write things down more often. His tone was sharp, clipped at the ends, nothing like the polite concern he offered in public. That evening, as I walked past the guest room, I heard his voice through the crack of the door. He was whispering, not the way people whisper to avoid waking someone, but the way they whisper when they don't want to be overheard. I paused and listened. He said the word timelines, followed by something muffled then. He won't fight it. The sentence landed like a cold hand at the back of my neck. I stepped back before he opened the door, and when he saw me, he acted startled, as if I were the one creeping through shadows. The next morning, while he fetched something from his car, I noticed his key ring lying on the kitchen counter. My house key rested on it, Not the one I gave him years ago for emergencies, another one. A new copy, clean and shiny, without the small scratch mine had. He must have made it recently. I held it between my fingers for a few seconds, feeling the weight of what it meant. Someone doesn't make an extra key unless they expect to enter a place without asking. I set it back where he left it, letting the truth settle in quietly. Something wasn't simply happening around me. Something was being arranged, piece by piece, and I had just seen the first crack in the story he'd been trying to sell me. I drove to the bank the next morning, taking the longer route through back streets so I could clear my head before speaking to anyone. The transaction I'd seen online sat in my mind like a small stone that wouldn't shift. The bank lobby was quiet when I walked in, the kind of quiet that makes every sound sharper. A young clerk greeted me with a practiced smile and asked how she could help. I told her I wanted to verify recent activity on my account. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard a moment too long before she typed. I watched her eyes move across the screen, then pause. That pause felt heavier than any number on the account. She asked if I had recently come in to authorize someone to assist with inquiries. The question landed in the space between us with a cold shape. I told her no. Her expression changed slightly, the kind of change people are taught to hide but can't fully control. She lowered her voice and said someone had asked about my account last week. When I asked who, she hesitated, then said she wasn't allowed to give names without permission. The hesitation said enough. She didn't need to say my brother's name for me to hear it. I thanked her and asked for printed statements. She handed them over with a look that suggested she knew more, but couldn't say it. Back home, I brought the papers into my study. The room always felt safe to me, lined with old files and memories stacked neatly on shelves. Today, it felt different. I noticed the top drawer wasn't fully closed. I keep that drawer exact, pushed in until it clicks. I pulled it open and saw the files weren't in the order I left them. Folders that belonged on the left side were on the right. Envelopes I stored flat were leaning upright. Someone had gone through them, and not in a hurry. I sat down slowly and started looking through each stack. A few minutes later, I found a folder that didn't belong in the drawer at all. It was one I kept locked in a small cabinet. When I opened it, a piece of paper slid out. A drafted power of attorney form with my name, address, and information already filled in. My hand went still. The lines were typed cleanly, and the only thing missing was my signature. Attached to the form were 2 sticky notes. The first said, "Sign when weak." The handwriting was unmistakable. The second note said, "Medical leverage," with a question mark beside it. The question mark made it worse, because it showed planning, not impulse. These weren't reminders written in a rush. They were steps someone had been arranging over time. I set the papers down and let the room settle around me. Everything looked the same. The familiar shelves, the framed photos, the quiet window. But the feeling inside the room had changed. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a misplaced worry or an overstep from a man who didn't know how to show concern. This was structure. Thought out, practiced structure. I pulled the rest of the files from the drawer, checking each one. A few had small pencil marks near my signature, like someone had studied how I wrote it. Another had a page missing, replaced with a photocopy made on brighter paper. The more I looked, the clearer the picture became. I hadn't been imagining the shift. It was real, and it had been building quietly behind closed doors. I gathered the papers, placed them in a separate folder, and locked it away. The air felt colder as I closed the drawer. I didn't panic. I didn't raise my voice. I just sat there with the truth settling in its proper place. This plan didn't start last week or last month. It had roots, and someone who digs roots that deep isn't planning to stop on his own. The truth began to surface in small pieces, never loud, never dramatic, but sharp enough to cut through any doubt I had left. It happened the next afternoon when my neighbor, Mrs. Keller, waved me over while I was taking the trash to the curb. She looked uneasy, the way people do when they're carrying information they're not sure they should share. She asked if everything was all right, then mentioned she had seen my brother walking the property line 2 days earlier with a man she didn't recognize. When she described the man, clipboard, dress shoes, short answers, I knew what he was. Realtors always have the same posture, the same detached way of looking at things. She said my brother pointed toward the backyard and told the man, "We'll have it listed soon." Her words didn't come with any judgment, but they hit like a cold hand on my spine. I thanked her and kept my voice steady, but the ground felt different under my feet as I walked back to the house. Back inside, I leaned on the counter for a moment and let the weight of what she'd said settle in. He wasn't circling the idea. He was moving forward as if he already owned the place. Later that evening, I sat down at my desk to check some old emails and clear my inbox. I opened a folder I rarely touched, and that's when I saw a thread of messages I didn't recognize. They were drafts. Messages clearly meant for someone else, saved on my computer, but unsigned. In them, my brother spoke about my decline and my growing confusion in a tone that sounded rehearsed. He described me as someone slipping, someone who needed intervention. He even mentioned that I was struggling to keep the property in order, a lie so bold it took a moment for my brain to process it. Most disturbing was a line near the end of one draft. Once I have full authority, I can move things quickly. That wasn't concern. That was ambition dressed as duty. I closed the laptop slowly, making sure my breathing stayed even. The room around me felt colder, as if the walls were listening. I checked my appointment calendar next, something I hadn't updated in weeks, and noticed a change. A medical appointment I never moved was now rescheduled. The time slot was shifted by 2 days, and the confirmation email, sent to my account, had been opened. I didn't open it. Someone else had. I called the clinic to confirm, and the nurse on the phone said, "Your brother requested the change on your behalf. He said you weren't feeling well." I told her I hadn't made the request. There was a brief silence, the kind that carries worry on the other side of the line. She apologized and put the appointment back where it belonged. When I hung up, the picture became painfully clear. He wasn't simply pushing boundaries or overstepping. He was building a case, piece by piece, designed to show that I wasn't capable of managing my own life. Missing mail, unauthorized inquiries, pre-filled documents, whispered timelines, now manipulated medical records. The steps formed a path that led directly to one outcome, taking control of my affairs. I stood at the window and looked out at the yard I'd tended for years. The grass, the fence, the old oak, it all held memories I couldn't replace. And for the first time, the fear wasn't about losing control of my accounts or my routines. It was about losing my home. The stakes had risen without a sound, and the house I built my life in was now something my own brother had marked for removal from under me. It wasn't a future threat. It was already in motion, and if I didn't act carefully, he would walk through this place with a realtor again. This time not as a visitor, but as the man who believed he had the right to sell it. I sat in my car for several minutes before walking into the law office, letting the engine tick in the silence. It had been years since I last stepped into that building. The same glass door, the same brass handle, but this time I wasn't coming in for business matters or paperwork about a property sale. I was coming in with something colder sitting in my chest, something I needed confirmed by someone who understood the rules better than I did. When I finally pushed the door open, the receptionist recognized my name and led me down the hall without asking questions. The lawyer looked older, but not weaker. His hair was grayer, his posture straighter, and his eyes stayed sharp in a way that told me he had spent decades reading people before they spoke. He shook my hand and gestured for me to sit. I didn't waste time with small talk. I told him what had been happening over the past weeks: the missing mail, the copied key, the inquiries at the bank, the emails, the rescheduled appointment. I laid each fact down like a brick, steady and controlled, because I needed him to see this clearly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't even blink. He took notes with the same precision he used 30 years ago when we worked together. When I finished, he set the pen down and leaned back slightly, the chair releasing a slow creak that seemed to echo in the quiet room. He said the pattern was familiar, too familiar. He explained that financial targeting of older adults rarely starts with dramatic moves. It begins exactly like this: small shifts, controlled narratives, subtle manipulation of documents, changes in medical records. Each step is designed to show a decline, even when there is none. He said my brother wasn't helping or protecting me. He was building a claim that I was no longer competent to manage my own affairs. The words hit harder than any suspicion I'd held. Hearing it from someone trained to see these patterns stripped away the last layer of doubt. My brother wasn't improvising. He wasn't reacting to real concerns. He had a plan, and that plan needed me to look incapable. The lawyer explained that once someone establishes enough evidence, They can petition for control, property, accounts, medical decisions. It happens quietly and legally, long before the victim realizes what's being taken. He asked if I had any old documents, contracts, partnership agreements, anything from the years my brother and I worked together. At first, the list felt too broad. I told him most of those papers were buried in old boxes I hadn't opened in years. But as he spoke, something surfaced in my memory, faint at first, then solid. There had been a document we signed when we ended our business partnership. He had insisted on one clause, and I had insisted on another. I couldn't remember the exact language, but I remembered the argument that led to that clause, and I remembered how determined I was at the time to protect my authority. I mentioned it to the lawyer, and he leaned forward slightly, the first sign of energy he'd shown since I sat down. He asked what the clause involved. I didn't know the exact wording, only that it dealt with managerial rights and future claims. He said that if such a document existed, and if it was signed and notarized, it might carry more weight than I realized. Not a miracle, not a weapon, just leverage. Enough leverage to push back against someone preparing a case behind my back. He told me to find it, bring it to him, not mention any of this to my brother. The tone of his voice made it clear the timeline was tight. The threat wasn't distant anymore. It was active, and if I didn't get ahead of it, my brother's version of me would become the one the world believed. I waited until late evening to open the safe box, choosing the hour when the house felt still and no one would drop by unannounced. The metal box had sat untouched for years, pushed to the back of a closet behind winter coats I no longer wore. I carried it to the dining table and set it down carefully, feeling the familiar weight of old paper and older decisions. The lock turned with some resistance, as if the years had stiffened the mechanism, and the lid lifted with a muted scrape. Inside were folders from the days when my brother and I worked side by side, back when trust came easily, and paperwork felt like a formality rather than protection. I sorted through the files slowly, not rushing the process. Contracts, receipts, partnership forms, all the pieces of a small business that had once kept us both grounded. Then, near the bottom, I found a folder thicker than the others. The edges were marked with age, the paper yellowed slightly, but the staples were still intact. When I opened it, the first page made my breath tighten. It was the agreement we signed at the end of our business partnership, notarized, witnessed, and stamped. 30 years old, but sharp in its language. It transferred managerial rights back to me fully, and carried a clause I had nearly forgotten, one preventing him from claiming decision-making authority over my property or assets. In the future, under any circumstance. I read the clause twice, making sure the wording was as strong as I remembered. There was nothing vague about it. The terms were blunt, binding, and absolute. It struck me how different things felt then, how that argument, which seemed like a simple disagreement at the time, had created a safeguard I never expected to need. I placed the document gently into a new folder, something clean and unmistakable, and locked the rest of the papers away. The next morning, I brought the folder to the lawyer. He read every line carefully, tracing the stamped seal at the bottom with the edge of his thumb. He didn't smile, but there was a shift in his eyes, a recognition of something solid. He said the document didn't solve everything, but it created leverage, the kind that could stop a claim before it gained traction. His advice was simple. Do not show it yet. Let my brother continue. Let him press. Let him reveal how far he intended to go. The timing of the reveal mattered, and using it too early would only give him room to adjust. When I returned home, I found my brother waiting in the driveway. He approached my car before I even turned off the engine, hands moving with restless energy. He asked where I'd been, why I'd left early, and whether I had finally decided what to do about the property. His questions came fast, each one coated with impatience he couldn't hide anymore. The mask of concern had slipped. Ambition showed through the cracks. I stepped out of the car and answered calmly, offering nothing beyond polite deflection. He didn't like it. His jaw tightened, and he demanded a timeline. His word, not mine. He said the house needed a plan, and that we should finalize things soon. I nodded lightly, giving him the impression that his pressure was working. The more he believed he was steering the situation, the more exposed his intentions became. As he talked, his eyes moved over the house again, the same measuring glance he used during his late-night visit. But this time, I felt no panic. There was a quiet steadiness settling inside me. The document in my possession was a boundary he didn't know existed, and every question he asked only built the case against him. I let him speak until he ran out of demands, then walked inside with a steady pace. He thought he was closing in. He thought I was bending. He didn't know I was waiting for the perfect moment to pull the ground out from under him. He showed up without calling, pounding on the door hard enough to rattle the frame. I opened it slowly, and he pushed past me before I could speak, his eyes sharp and restless. He walked straight into the living room, dropping a folder onto the coffee table with a loud slap. He said we needed to finalize the paperwork today. His voice clipped and fast, like he'd been rehearsing the line in the car. When I didn't move, he jabbed a finger at the folder and told me there was no reason to delay something so simple. He paced once across the room, then turned on me with a stare that carried more impatience than concern. He said my recent forgetfulness was making everything harder, and that the sooner we put things under proper management, the better it would be for everyone. The words came out coated in false sympathy. He spoke as if he were rescuing me from myself. I stood still and let the accusations hang in the air. He said I was unsafe, living alone, that I was overwhelmed, and that I didn't realize how far things had slipped. Each sentence was delivered with confidence, the kind of confidence that comes from expecting no resistance. Instead of arguing, I asked him a simple question: what exactly had slipped? He blinked, caught off guard for a moment, then mumbled something about bills and appointments. I asked which bills, which appointments. His sentence stumbled. He tried to recover by saying I wouldn't remember anyway. I kept my tone steady and asked why a medical appointment had been changed without my consent. His jaw shifted slightly. Then I asked why he had been speaking to a realtor about listing the property. He didn't answer. He raised his voice then, not shouting, but speaking faster and louder, trying to regain control of the moment. He said I was misunderstanding everything and should just sign the new documents so he could handle what I no longer could. The folder on the table remained untouched between us. I glanced toward the doorway, and right on cue, the lawyer stepped inside. I had given him permission earlier, and he arrived exactly when I needed him. My brother's expression froze when he saw him. Surprise cracked through his confidence. The lawyer greeted him politely and sat down without ceremony, placing his briefcase beside the chair. My brother demanded to know why he was there. The lawyer answered calmly that he had been asked to review certain matters. Nothing more. No accusations. No sharp tone. Just quiet authority. My brother stood stiffly, unsure whether to sit or run. I reached into a drawer beneath the coffee table and took out the folder containing the old agreement. I placed it on top of his paperwork, the sound crisp and final. He watched my hand with growing confusion. I opened the folder and turned it toward him so he could see the first page. The notarized document we signed 30 years ago. The seal was clear. The signatures were clear. The clause was clear. His authority ended the day he signed it. He leaned forward, reading faster and faster, his breathing changing as the meaning sank in. The clause preventing him from claiming future control stood out like a line of fire across the page. He looked at the lawyer, then at me, waiting for some explanation that might undo the words written in ink, older than most of his excuses. None came. His face tightened, then loosened, then fell into something hollow. The plan he had pushed, shaped, and moved toward for weeks collapsed in a single moment, not because of a fight, not because of anger, because the truth sat in front of him in his own handwriting, binding him to a promise he never thought he'd have to face again. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. The silence said everything he finally understood. The ground he believed he owned was never his at all. The house felt different the morning after the confrontation, quieter in a way that carried more truth than tension. I sat at the kitchen table while the lawyer reviewed the old agreement again, making notes about the next steps. He said we needed to move quickly. My brother's behavior wasn't just reckless. It crossed into legal territory. He drafted the filings to secure my estate and freeze any attempt to interfere with my property, accounts, or medical decisions. Watching him work was oddly calming. Every form he completed reclaimed something my brother tried to take. By noon, the filings were submitted. They weren't dramatic, and they didn't need to be. They created a clear record. I was capable, competent, and protected by a document that left no room for interpretation. The lawyer explained that the next step involved notifying my brother directly, not to shame him, not to corner him, simply to make the boundary official. It was procedure, but procedure carries weight when someone has been pushing from the shadows. Later that afternoon, an officer came to my door, not with sirens or accusations, just a clipboard and a steady voice. He explained that, due to the filings, he was required to inform my brother that he could not contact me without permission. It wasn't an arrest. It wasn't punishment. It was a warning backed by law. When the officer left, the air inside the house felt less crowded. There was space again, the kind I didn't realize I'd been missing. Word spread through the family faster than I expected. A few relatives called, pretending they were checking on me but asking careful questions about what happened. They weren't looking for understanding. They were choosing sides. Some were shocked. Others admitted they had noticed his behavior but didn't know how far it had gone. No one defended him once the truth came out. Reputation damage isn't loud. It appears in the hesitations, the shorter phone calls, the quiet shift in how people speak someone's name. I spent the next day securing the house. The locksmith arrived in the morning and replaced every lock. Front door, back door, garage, even the side gate. He handed me a new set of keys, each one clean and untouched, and asked if anyone else needed a copy. I told him no, just me. After he left, I updated passwords, closed the joint account my brother had pressured me to open years ago, and flagged my information with the bank so no one could inquire without speaking to me directly. It wasn't paranoia. It was maintenance, something I should have done sooner. In the evening, I sat in the living room and let the quiet settle around me. It wasn't victory I felt, not triumph, just a grounded sense of relief, mixed with a heaviness I couldn't shake. The betrayal wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't come with shouting or broken relationships thrown across a table. It came in small steps, quiet moves, and decisions made when I wasn't looking. Those cut deeper than any argument ever could. I thought about the years we spent working together, the trust I didn't question, and the way he used that history as a pathway into my life now. The truth didn't destroy me, but it changed something in me. Not fear, not bitterness, just a new understanding of how close danger can stand without being seen. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the weight lift slowly, piece by piece. My home was safe again. My accounts were mine again. But the space where trust once lived felt different, emptier, quieter, and honest, in a way I hadn't faced before. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that doesn't press on your ears but settles around you like a familiar coat. I sat in my study with the lamp turned low, the same lamp my wife used to read under, and let the room breathe with me. The papers were finally organized, the locks changed, and the tension that once lived inside these walls had thinned into something manageable. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt honest. I could hear the clock ticking, steady and unbothered, like it had been waiting for the house to return to its natural rhythm. I leaned back in my chair and let my eyes settle on the shelves across the room. So many years lived inside these walls, and so many changes I never expected. Trust, I realized, doesn't break in a single moment. It erodes, sometimes slowly, sometimes in pieces too small to notice at first. One mistruth here, one careless assumption there, and before you've understood what's gone wrong, the distance has already taken shape. I had seen that erosion without knowing it. Only now, with everything laid bare, could I trace the line back to where it began. Getting older changes how people look at you. Some see wisdom, some see fragility, and some see opportunity. Vulnerability isn't always a matter of weakness. Sometimes, it's simply a matter of standing alone long enough for the wrong person to imagine a doorway where none exists. I had been alone for years, comfortable, capable, steady. But to someone with ambition, that solitude must have looked like a chance to take what wasn't theirs. The danger wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It came softly, through small steps, through a voice that sounded like concern, but carried a different meaning beneath it. I pulled a folder from the drawer and set it on the desk. Not because I needed to read it again, but because it served as a reminder of something simple. Protection is a responsibility, not a reaction. It belongs to the person whose name is on the papers, whose home holds the memories, whose life is shaped by the choices inside those walls. Elders don't lose that responsibility unless they give it away, and too many give it away because they believe they're being cared for. I learned that care should be measured by actions, not promises. If there is anything I would tell someone my age sitting in a house like mine, it's this. Document everything. Trust little. Verify often. Put your name on what belongs to you and keep records of every agreement, every change, every signature. Kindness doesn't replace caution, love doesn't replace clarity, and a familiar face doesn't guarantee good intentions. These rules aren't signs of fear, they're signs of respect for yourself, your life, and the work it took to build both. I looked around the study again, feeling something steady settle inside me. This place was still mine, not because of a form filed last week, but because I had protected it when it mattered. The victory wasn't about stopping my brother. It was about keeping hold of my dignity. He tried to shape a version of me that didn't exist, but the truth held stronger than his assumptions. My home, my decisions, my life. None of it slipped the way he claimed. The lamp flickered slightly, and I reached out to steady the switch. Growing old, I thought, doesn't mean stepping aside. It doesn't mean surrendering your place in your own home or letting someone else narrate your story. The years may change a man, but they don't empty him. The final truth settled in my mind with quiet certainty. Growing old doesn't mean giving up your power unless you hand it to the wrong person.